Sri Lanka is marking 10 years since the end of the decades-long civil war that tore the country apart. But why are sectarian tensions still simmering? I'm Malika Bilal, and you're in this stream. Today, we'll take a look at the fallout from a recent wave of anti-Muslim violence.
And I'm Ahmed Shabuldin. We'll discuss the sensitive situation, explore the government's response, and ask what this all means for Sri Lanka's future. And as always, we want to hear from you, so tweet us at AJStream or join our live YouTube chat.
2 weeks ago, a wave of anti-Muslim riots broke out across the country after the Easter Sunday attacks on churches and hotels. While ISIL claimed responsibility for the Easter attack, the government has blamed local armed group, the National Thawheed Jamaath. During the riots, mobs moved through towns, ransacking mosques, burning Qur'ans, and hurling petrol bombs at shops. Authorities have so far arrested more than 70 suspected rioters, including some described as Sinhala Buddhist extremists.
Sri Lanka's Muslims make up less than 10% of the country's 22 million people. The Sinhalese, who are Buddhist, make up around 75% of the population. Meanwhile, the government has called for peace and vowed to protect all citizens. And the United Nations asked for a rejection of hate. And since the curfew was lifted last week, there has been no further violence. But with old wounds reopened and lingering resentment exposed, how does Sri Lanka move forward?
Well, with us to discuss, Amarnath Amarasingam is Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue in Toronto, Canada. Farah Mihlar is a human rights activist and lecturer in conflict studies at the University of Exeter in the UK. And in Colombo, Sri Lanka, Manel Fernandez is a correspondent with Al Jazeera English and has been covering this story extensively. Welcome to the stream, all of you. It's good to have you here, though not good circumstances. I want to start with you, Manel. Talk to us about the mood across the country from the reports that you're hearing.
Malika, a couple of weeks on since basically that outbreak of violence targeted at the Muslim community following the Easter Sunday bombing, things are somewhat subdued. Obviously, that initial flashpoint where we saw the violence tending to spread, to other sort of tense areas which had Muslim populations living side by side with other communities. But having brought that kind of under control after the initial couple of days when things just went out of control phenomenally, now sort of a couple of weeks on, things are, if we could explain it as a sort of an uneasy calm. It's not to say that everything's back to normal. It's not, obviously. The tensions that kind of spilled over are still in certain areas simmering, a little bit under the surface, but very much sort of being clamped down on and under control for the moment. Malika?
Simmering under the surface. Amarnath, I want you to have a look at this headline. It came out just yesterday, on Monday. This from Foreign Policy. Buddhist anger could tear Sri Lanka apart. And I'm going to scroll down to the part that I think is most interesting about this piece. The author writes, the attacks shouldn't simply be viewed as direct retaliation for the bombing. So the attacks referencing the anti-Muslim riots are not directly related then to the Easter Sunday bombings. Amarnath, what do you make of that? Do you see a direct link there between these two?
I mean, there is a direct link in the sense that this time around, the attacks were much more vicious. More attacks happened, more buildings were destroyed than, say, for example, in 2018, March, when we had similar riots, or 2014, when we had similar events, or going back, all the way to 1915, when we saw the kind of birth of the anti-Muslim riots happening in Sri Lanka. So in a sense, it's completely accurate to say that this is a long-running tension that predates the Easter attacks, and a lot in the Muslim community, the ones I've been talking to over the last few weeks, have been quite open in saying that things feel a little different this time around, right? Things feel a little bit more tense. They feel like the usual use of their communities for political ends to kind of speak to the base, rile up the base, is much more intense and visceral this time around. And I think a lot in the community are quite scared this time around because they feel like the attacks were so massive and so catastrophic that anything could happen.
You say anything could happen, and whether there is a direct link or not, a lot of people online talking about the rise in mistrust. Farah, I want to read 2 quick tweets that came from Prabhu saying, there's an increase in the mistrust, the suspicion and profiling, which has led to discrimination against the Muslim community, especially in the aftermath of the Easter attacks. The next tweet, he says, is, if there was clear and cohesive communication and management of the crisis by the government, it would lead to mitigation of such discrimination to a greater degree. The politicization of the current situation makes it worse. Does that, in fact, make it worse? And what do you think is leading to this kind of sensitive situation?
I quite agree to some extent. I think that there are 2 dimensions to this anti-Muslim sentiment. One is the violence that we see and we've seen before. The other aspect is there's been a widespread hate campaign against Muslims on social media that has also existed now for almost a decade, that spreads the most ludicrous kind of thinking about Muslims that are trying to take over the country, that they're trying to get engaged in increasing their population, and they're a threat to Sri Lanka. Now, there are large numbers of people who believe this, and there are numbers of people who don't as well. I've conducted interviews in sort of the very Buddhist heartland of Sri Lanka, where I've spoken to Sinhalese Buddhists who actually do believe some of this, and they've even told me that their monks tell them this. So there is a level of mistrust that exists, and the political situation in Sri Lanka, particularly the government's response to these attacks, has not helped at all. The media as well, the national mainstream media, hasn't helped in that they report a kind of a day-to-day, hour-to-hour account of what they broadly constitute as extremism amongst Muslims, as Islamic violence, but they don't really break it down. They don't explain the nuances, and they don't counter it with explaining about what the Muslim community faces, so the kind of day-to-day discrimination they face, the violence they face.
So you mentioned widespread hate, and I wanted to give our audience a little taste of where that might come from and where the tensions between different ethnic groups and religious groups in Sri Lanka lies. So our colleague Bernard Smith was in some of the areas where anti-Muslim violence took place, and he spoke to a few Buddhist village leaders. Here's what one of them told him about the challenges in repairing relations. Have a look.
We'd like to talk with Muslim and Muslim community leaders to have a discussion and live in an amicable way. To be able to live harmoniously, Muslims need to realize this is not Arabia, this is Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has a culture and a civilization and an identity.
So Amarnath, where does that come from, that idea of questioning Muslims in Sri Lanka's Sri Lankanness?
I mean, this goes back quite a while. I mean, that was a very interesting clip to listen to because, I mean, myself, I'm a Tamil Canadian by background, and I mean, we've dealt with the community in the north and east have dealt with this similar kind of majoritarianism for a long time. And I think there's a deep sense amongst a lot of minorities that this is very structural. This goes up. This is very much part of what it means to be a Sri Lankan state. That it's a majoritarian Buddhist and Buddhist and Sinhala at its core. And this idea that there's room for minorities is not entirely clear what that would look like, what integration looks like, or what assimilation looks like. Particularly because minorities in Sri Lanka also hold kind of very deep ethnic and religious identities themselves, and it's not really framed as a kind of broader multicultural conversation. It's one more of I don't know, some giving up who you are to be us, but it's not entirely clear what that looks like in an ethno state. And I mean, just to add something to the conversation earlier, it's quite heartbreaking to me that, you know, the Muslim community went through so much over the last 20, 30 years, right? We had the expulsion from the north by the LTTE in 1990. You had massacres in the several mosques in the east in 1990. You had a variety of different riots over the years in 2013, 14, 17, 18. And never was this conversation that the kind of Sinhala Buddhist majority needs to look within itself to figure out what's wrong with the kind of culture of the country. Never was that conversation a thing. It was only after the Easter attacks that all of a sudden it's the Muslim community that needs to look within itself to figure out what was wrong. When in fact, I mean, going back, we've never seen a kind of jihadist mobilization. We've never seen even the rise of a militant movement within the Muslim community to respond to these kinds of attacks over the years. So,
can I just add to that? I somewhat agree with Amarnath there as well. But I think what I need to explain is that there's been a kind of an Islamic resurgence amongst Muslims, and there's been several reform movements that have taken place amongst Muslims. And this happens usually in situations of conflict. It's not unusual where religious identity, where religion itself can transform and be entrenched. Muslims are not the only community that have experienced this. We've seen it somewhat amongst Christians and also Buddhists as well. So this is the kind of general context, but there have been several reform movements, and there have been lots of changes that have taken place where Muslims have wanted to identify perhaps closer with Islam and exert that identity publicly. Now, this is broadly, after these attacks, been seen as extremist and as Arabized, and there is an element of of this Arabization, but it's not in its entirety. And I think, as Amarnath said, the important thing to identify is Muslims had an option throughout the 30-year conflict to also become part of the militant group, to take on violence, to change their course of action. But they didn't. They rejected it. And we must not forget that Muslim civil society leaders and religious leaders did warn the police. They did warn the establishment of these extremist groups and these individuals, and that they were not arrested. The action wasn't taken, and now the entire Muslim community is paying a price for the government's failure.
And Farah, as you're talking there, I can see Manal trying to get in. I wanted, just because Farah mentioned the government response, I do want to share with our audience what that sounded like, because they have made comments about what they're doing and what should be done. So have a listen to what that official response sounds like.
This small group must stop the dangerous game they play against the lives and property of innocent people. I must state that we won't allow the country to be led to anarchy by those who show their strength on unarmed, innocent civilians.
I have given all necessary powers to the security forces to take stern action against those breaching the peace by violating the curfew and emergency law. Security forces will take all steps to take action against those breaching the law. Therefore, I request the fullest cooperation to the military and police to safeguard peace.
And that's a response from the Chief of Police and the Sri Lankan Prime Minister. But Manal, what did you want to add?
Malika, one thing, as Farah talked about in times of conflict, how sort of this extreme ideologies or views tend to be perpetuated and find sort of fertile ground. Bear in mind that even the sort of anti-Muslim sentiment that we saw spilling over a few weeks ago, other than the initial flashpoints, which if you go down to the root of those actual incidents, yes, there were sort of local tensions. There was a lot of grief following the Easter Sunday bomb attacks. There was kind of an outpouring of anger and frustration among the people, and this led to some of those flashpoints. But very quickly, in sort of the space of 24, 48 hours, we found those emotions almost hijacked by organized groups. And one of the things where the anti-Muslim violence is concerned in Sri Lanka is the role played by extremists. I mean, essentially Buddhist extremists with a real heavy nationalist bent. This has been about, safeguarding the country, about, being the Sinhala Buddhist state, talking about this 2,500-year history and tradition of Buddhism and things like that. So it's not in terms of the majority, the average Buddhist man on the street, but very much driven and perpetuated by these extreme sort of elements. And I think that has also sort of been proven in terms of some of the arrests that have been made. The authorities say there are a number of high-profile people that have been taken in. They've been arrested, they've been named, and among these are figures who played a key role in violence against Muslims in previous occasions. For example, in March 2018, there was the leader of a group called the Mahasan Balakaya, who was proved to have been sort of inciting hate speech, spurring people to organize, essentially on social media platforms and things like that. So that is
Right.
a fact that we have to sort of work into this this mix,
Right.
so to speak.
And
Malika?
Manal, you bring up social media platforms. Obviously, they've played a role in spreading some of that hatred, if you will. We also have a viewer commenting on another aspect, someone who is watching live on YouTube, Elizabeth Rainey, chiming in saying, from the interviews I've seen, nationalism has had a big role in escalating these tensions. Farah, with that in mind, I want to play for you a video comment that we received from Mira Selva. She's the director of journalism. It's a fellowship at Reuters Institute. Take a listen to what she said.
The media in Sri Lanka has long been divided by language and ethnicity. Social media has provided a space since the war ended in 2009 for these communities that have been divided by geography and by ethnicity and by religion to come together and create a national dialogue, helps a new civil society spring up across the country. It would be a huge shame if the social media ban and a kind of clamp down on the press ended this new conversations that are just beginning inside a country that has a very long history of killing and murdering journalists and suppressing press freedom.
Farah, your thoughts?
Well, it's not an area I have expertise on, but what I can say is that social media is certainly an avenue for people to report incidents. So, for example, some of the violence against Muslims was not being reported on the national mainstream media, but it came out of social media. So there was an opportunity. It's a form of documenting, reporting on human rights violations that otherwise may not happen and may not get across to the rest of the country. However, having said that, it's also very much used for spreading hate, for racist campaigns. And so to that extent, I think particularly at the immediate aftermath of the events, some of the restrictions imposed, I think had some effect. They made a difference. However, what was problematic was that whilst that was done, the government was not complementing that by taking action on the ground. So you had, for example, security forces and police not arresting perpetrators, in some cases watching the violence. Now, the question is, if you're going to act like that on the ground, why then ban social media?
Mm-hmm. So I wanted to give our audience a taste of what some of those campaigns look like, because Amarnath has done the hard, dirty work for us. So we don't have to sift through some of that hate speech, but this is what it looks like when it's spread online and it's spread on WhatsApp. So Amarnath, you tweeted this, and so I'm sharing the thread that you sent. Don't shop at Muslim clothing stores. They're spraying sterilization cream on women's underwear. That was a 2013 conspiracy, right? Don't eat at Muslim restaurants. They're putting sterilization pills in your food. 2018 conspiracy. These started on Facebook and WhatsApp and led to real violence. And you go on to say it was economic, but it tapped into a deeply seated Sinhala nationalist anxiety that they weren't going to be the majority forever. Tamils tried to split your country and failed. Muslims are playing the long game and will slowly displace you by halting your birth rates. Talk to us about that research that you really had to do there, Amarnath, and these sentiments that are underlying this.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, this is kind of long running, right? Tamil academics used to call it the majority with the minority complex, where a lot of Sinhala Buddhist nationalists actually feel like even though they're a majority on the Sri Lankan, like on the island, they're still a minority in the region, and they're eventually going to be displaced. This kind of holy land that was given to them by the Buddha himself is going to be taken away from them, and so on. It's very difficult to say how much those kinds of belief systems are part of the leadership, as was said earlier, or how much they actually trickle down to everyday people around the country, because I don't think we have any real important stats on them. But it is this kind of fear, and the way in which these conspiracies and fears actually play out in the online space, on WhatsApp groups and Facebook groups, actually lead or actually serve as a kind of spark sometimes for real violence that happens on the ground, which all of a sudden then gets mobilized by political leaders or sometimes law enforcement officials we've seen this time around, who go from town to town carrying out violence. So this little kind of spark online then leads to real days-long or weeks-long violence, which is insane. But that's what we've seen over the last several years, over and over again.
Well, Amarnath, it's interesting you bring that up. It seems like there's a cycle of violence, or at least you say this is happening over and over again. Namil Nizam talking about one thing that has changed on Twitter. 1972 marks a special chapter in history of ethnic relations and violence. For example, changing the name from Ceylon to Sri Lanka, and Buddhism as the state religion causing resentment and displeasure among the non-Sinhalese. Farah, with that in mind, I mean, you know, Malika just read a thread from Amarnath. There's a lot of Twitter threads about this topic. It seems like, you know, it's something that people feel very passionately about. I want to share one with you, get your thoughts on it. Amra saying the radicalization of youth across the ethnic groups in the country led to recent violence and religious tension in Ika. While radical Muslim youth were behind the Easter Sunday attacks, the anti-Muslim riots were led by Sinhalese Buddhist nationals. She goes on to say that on the community level, there's a climate of fear and us versus them mentality, which is doing harm, and people need to be responsible with what they post online. Turning to social media to vent isn't a great coping mechanism. Could you just dissect for us what you think that radicalization of youth has to do, if anything, with what's playing out online and how that factors into what we see happening on the streets?
I can try to, but I think what we need to be clear about is that there is the nationalist dimension to this, the political dimension to this, and then the kind of the everyday dimension to it, okay? So the nationalist dimension we've talked a bit about here, and that has its history, and it comes up, keeps coming up, as Amarnath said, in cycles, very much associated with armed conflict as well, the causes for the conflict, and perhaps where we are today. Now, politicians tend to dip in and out of this, or they sometimes jump on the bandwagon and take it out, and then they can at times lead to also mob violence and what we're seeing today. Now, how this spreads across to the everyday level is slightly more complex. And as Amarnath said, we don't have statistics, but we can follow from social media to see that some of these hate campaigns in particularly are widely believed. And I have spoken, as I said earlier, to people who do believe it. With regards to the radicalization, I think in terms of, if I can speak for the Muslim community, I don't really know it from the Buddhist and the Sinhalese side, but for the Muslim community, I think we have to put this into context. It's really swept the country, these events, these bombings, and shocked a lot of people. But we're talking about a very small fringe group here. And if you're talking about, say, 200 people who might have been radicalized, we still need to put it into context of a 2 million population. So I don't think from my research amongst Muslims and on religious extremism and on religious movements, I wouldn't argue that this is a very prominent, large-scale radicalization that is taking place amongst Muslims. Amarnath, I think you wanted to add something there.
Yeah, I've been spending the last month or so doing interviews with people on the ground, mostly activist communities. And what is kind of clear is the kind of biography of Zahran Hashim, this kind of purported mastermind of the attacks. He was, kicked out of his madrasa when he was just graduating. He was started his own organization, which then itself kicked him out. He carried on to eventually get into arguments and conflict with almost every single one of the Thawheed organizations that existed in the country. Followed then to start his own organization, the National Thawheed Jamaath, which eventually also kicked him out in December 2017. And it was only after the kind of candy riots of March 2018 that he eventually started talking about attacking Sri Lanka, killing non-believers and things like that. And it seems pretty clear that over the course, at least as early as January 2017, the Muslim community in Katankoti, where he lived, was pushing back against him over and over and over again, and had actually gone, a lot of these organizations had handed over videos that he was posting on YouTube to law enforcement, had handed them over to intel communities, and basically nothing was done, right? So I do think this idea of there's a widespread radicalization in the Muslim community is a bit silly, because what we see is that the NTJ and Zahran basically mobilized his own little network around him, his family members around him. It wasn't a kind of widespread thing. In fact, we see most of the community push back throughout the tenor of the group.
This is exactly what I found as well, with conversations with contacts, including in Katankoti, where Zahran originates from. And I agree with Amarnath on that. But if we are to say, let's say that his ideology spread to more than his close family members, to more than his close networks, I still think we're only talking about a couple of hundred people at the most who might have listened to him and heard him.
I have to pause you on that point, which is an excellent point, but unfortunately, we're out of time for this part of the conversation. So I want to thank all of our guests for being here today. We have to leave it there. Ahmed and I will see you online, and we'll give online the last word.
Yes, Namil Nizam sharing with us this thought. We can keep piling up a list of incidents. Then at the end, we see every 10 years there has been a major incident happening. Sri Lanka is in a cycle of violence since a long time. So we want to thank you again to our guests and everyone who contributed to this conversation online. Remember, you can always tweet us at AJStream. We'll see you next time.